Welp, I beat the game again, this time with the Gallic forces. Much like with previous videos, Quality Games basically made his own tier list. You can basically find a video for it on his channel, and you can of course find a tier list they basically made right here. But anyhow, I basically made this one because again, I like to have stars to sort of distinguish between the generals and the non-generals, especially when the two units might have overlapping images. So without further ado, let's get to it. Starting off as usual, we got the Gallic Peasants. Barbarian Peasants, there's not a real difference between any of the peasants, but Barbarian Peasants, so yeah. And then, yeah, that's not really their main purpose, combat, but you basically use them for garrisoning your settlements, keeping order. The Gauls have to do this quite a bit because they're barbarians, so obviously squalor is an issue of their settlements, so this is a thing. They get the B tier, so not going to say much more on that. Warhounds, these guys get an F tier. Now I will note that the Gauls can use Warhounds to just be an additional fear factor against enemies, but that's more something I think is more centered toward Germania than them. For the Gauls, they can use the Druids basically to demoralize enemies and inspire their own, but it's probably a better off to have other units than these guys. So yeah, they're just a terrible unit I find for the Gallic forces, so whatever. Barbarian Cavalry and Barbarian Noble Cavalry. These guys are also lawable units. They go off of the peasants here in B tier. Now, to basically explain both these units right here, I'll note that basically cavalry spam is basically something that's very useful to the Gallic forces or keep ahead of the Romans as well as the Spanish forces to their south. Not so useful against the Germanians or against the Britons, but it's still very useful to sort of march down the Italian peninsula with a cav storm, so to speak, right away to knock out Rome before you have a chance to get Marian reforms and such. I'll note that basically in between in distinguishing which one's more useful than the other, I think the Barbarian Cavalry are probably a little bit more useful than Noble Cavalry because you basically you get these guys earlier, and once you basically get past the Romans and the Spanish, there's no real reason to basically use Barbarian Noble Cavalry all that much. You can use them against say Numidia if you go down south, and I actually did my playthrough, and to some extent against Carthage if they're still alive, but for the most part they're basically fairly equal in terms of your usefulness, but you need the Barbarian Cavalry to keep alive in the early games, so I'll basically put them ahead of these guys here. Alright, war bands. Now, this might be a shocker, but I don't consider these guys to be completely ineffective. Now, the thing about the warband is that it's a very weak unit that is basically available to the Dacians, the Gallic, and the Britons. The British don't really need to worry about having warbands because for the most part they got their traders to sort of carry them through their early game. Not really sure about Dacia, haven't played them yet, but with the Gallic forces, they definitely need to rely on warbands because they don't really have enough powerful sounds basically early on. And they need these guys basically to sort of stave off the throngs of enemies coming from all directions at them. So I actually had to use warbands quite a bit in my playthrough. And even though they have very weak combat ability, they're not exactly that great for garrison purposes. They don't really even feel much of a purpose besides just being a blob of units to sort of throw at enemies. But you kind of need them basically get around basically in the early game with Gauls. So they're not the worst unit. They have a purpose, just not the great unit. Swordsmen. Alright, so I was debating putting these guys basically in B tier of the other guys, but the thing about these guys is that their combat abilities are a little bit less useful than the Chosen Swordsman. And I didn't actually find I was using these guys a whole lot more than Chosen Swordsman or any other unit basically. So yeah, these guys basically they're a C tier unit I think in my mind. They're mediocre. They don't really have any real purpose early on other than say knocking out Britain's warbands, and if you can get say flank around Germanians spear warbands are okay for that. Basically these guys are your anti-spear unit basically early on, And you can basically get them out, like, in droves fairly quickly, and they're pretty useful for that. But, the thing about them is that, like, they're, like, a little bit too squishy and, like, easy to kill off. They do have good morale, so, I mean, they'll last, like, unlike these guys here, who basically run away at, like, the first light of trouble. But they're just, like, mediocre. Like, they just don't have, like, enough purpose, basically, to find, to, like, really, like, carry around with them too much. Now, the Chosen Swordsmen, these guys are worth, like, taking around. I consider Chosen Swordsmen here to be, like, really exemplary against, like, say, like, Germania and, like, eventually get down to, like, Macedon. These guys can actually, like, hold it with their morale, but they also have defense and as well as attack to sort of, like, be like a menace. I'll note that I actually use these guys to sort of take Syracuse from the Romans when they, as basically just trying to get them. And of course, like, Syracuse will have the stone walls. These guys were pretty useful for, like, storming the walls because, like, against, like, a Astati, they'll basically just, like, melt them. Even against, like, Principes, they have a fairly good, like, shot of, like, killing them without, like, much mercy, even on, like, very hard difficulty. Against, like, Macedon and as well as, like, Germania, against, like, Germania, basically guys will just, like, hold against spear warbands and then, flank around them pretty easily if, like, you get around to doing that. Against Macedon, they're not really going to hold against the flanks, like, pike block, but, if they basically flank against units, they'll basically kill them pretty quickly. Against some walls, they're pretty useful in that purpose too. So overall, a very laudable unit, ahead of Peasants even, so hooray for that. Alright, Naked Fanatics. Now, I'll note that I didn't really use Naked Fanatics in my campaign, but they probably would have been like a C-tier unit if I basically did. The thing about Naked Fanatics is that they required the Isis Temple, and I didn't really use, like, the Isis Temple until much later in the game, so I didn't really have any reason to really be building these guys. For, like, example, basically, I was basically using, like, Abnoma's Temple, like, a little bit for, like, the, like, Skirmisher and, like, the Force to Warbands a little bit. And then I use, like, the other temple that, like, basically gives experience, basically, to your guys for, like, the rest of the time. So a lot of my, like, sons, except for, like, I think, like, Alesia and, like, Pavium, they were basically all, like, the same temple, like, early on. So I didn't really have a chance really to build these guys, and, like, I didn't really miss them with, like, the, like, Gallic forces. I'll note that basically these guys would be nice for, like, they're, like, high morale, but, like, they're basically sort of filling the same role as the swordsmen early on. So, they're a little deficient, I think, for the Gallic formation, so, not much more saying that. Druids. These guys are even worse than War Dogs. Now, I'll note that Druids basically have a special ability to basically lower the morale of enemy units as well as, like, buff your own. But, well, I will note that basically this is very useful basically early on against the Britons if, like, you're against their chariots, but the thing about, like, Druids is that it's almost always better to basically have, like, an arrow, like, unit basically replace them. Not Warband, of course, but I mean, like, if you have, like, say, like, more like, Barbarian Chosen Swordsmen or, like, more like, Cavalry, they're usually better than, like, carrying a bunch of Druids basically around. So I'd rather basically have, like, those units over, like, this guy here. And these guys just take for, like, forever basically to train because they require, like, Isis, like, tier 3 temple, 2 turns to train. They're not that bad. I mean, like, if you really have to use them, like, you get one early on a game and they're useful, like, throughout until they basically get, like, wiped out. But they're a terrible unit, I think, really, for, just any real purpose. Now, another terrible unit basically to sort of note here is the Skirmisher Warband. These guys aren't as bad as, like, the Warband or the Naked Fanatics, but I didn't really build too many of these guys. And those I basically did, I found they're basically always running away because, like, they just don't have enough morale. They have the same morale as, like, a Warband. And they give you a little bit of, like, ranged firepower basically early on, so that's basically, like, one reason to basically build them. But they're just certainly, like, it's weaker than, like, the Force Warband you'll basically get later on. Now, Force Warband does have some issues, by the way, and I'll point them out in a moment. But these guys, I maybe, like, used a few of them where I really needed to, and, like, that's basically why I have a Skirmisher Warband, like, usually of 2. But you could probably, like, just do without these guys perhaps. So just to throw that in mind. Alright, Forester Warband. Now, I did use Forester Warbands toward, like, the later part of, like, the game. When I basically using the Forester Warband, I wiped out all the Roman factions, Spain, and Britain. So I was basically up against Germania and, like, Macedon at that point, as well as Numidia. Did use these guys against Numidia, didn't really need to because, like, Numidia was Numidia. But against, like, Macedon and, like, the Germanians, Against the Germanians, they're just going to just melt those guys like easily because of their like lack of like air protection. But I found like against like Macedon, they're just like not necessarily all that special. Yes, they have like the spears that sort of like blunt to charge like the Macedon warband, but they're like horses and stuff like that. But their archers basically like against the flanks is like not the greatest basically, so to speak. They can do some damage, but I mean you need to have a bunch of them sort of like do it, and like it's hard to basically get them. So I mean they're like a very powerful like ranged unit, but I just can't see them being like that great of a unit. So they go right there. They're laudable. All right, now I'll note that basically in terms of warlords here, you basically have like the warlord and chosen warlord. I didn't get to use the chosen warlord because like marched down to like Rome pretty fast to like basically wipe out like Rome, so I don't have to worry about like marrying reforms. But I will note that the original barbarian warlord you basically have right here, this guy is basically an S tier unit. I think that's basically him. Let's just see. Yeah, it's the basic warlord right there. And then the chosen warlord, he's just like probably like just like over here basically and like laudable. Now I'll note the reason basically the original warlord you basically get at the start of a campaign. These guys are important because essentially your warlord is basically going to be needed to like maintain like squalor levels in like certain zones like Patavium and like Corduba if you basically get around to it, or Carthage and stuff like that. And you also basically need them to like basically help like populate someone's like Sambrovia to like get over to the British like Isles, build up Alesia to sort of like get the tier 3 structures, etc., etc. And then on top of that, basically need these guys like in the field for like morale purposes to sort of like keep your guys from running away because like war bands, ugh. Overall, these guys are just fantastic units for like the Gallic forces, and there's nothing much more to say in that. Now I will note that basically down here is notice I have like nothing excellent. And that's because like these guys are like just like above and beyond like what they basically need to be. While the rest of the like factions like units down here are basically just like they're laudable, but they're not like necessarily excellent. So I probably could have actually like forgotten using like Force of Warband. It's like relied on more like Chosen like Warband. Like these guys would have been an excellent unit. Maybe I could like done like the Barbarian Cavalry, but I would like to use them basically once I basically get them. So there's that. But for the most part, I don't really consider like any units basically for the Gallic forces to be like just excellent. They're like just all like mediocre, so to speak. So you have like one really good like warlord, and then like everything else basically has like issues with it. Now in many ways, I actually very much enjoy playing with like the Gallic forces because of the fact that basically all units basically aren't necessarily stand out great. You have to basically use like the strengths and weaknesses of them to like their full extent. So I have to use cavalry against like the Spanish and like the Romans. You have to use like your like barbarian chosen like swordsman and swordsman against like the Britons and Germanians, etc., etc. Warbands even have a purpose because like you need them to sort of stave off early threats. They're basically going to try and like come in from all sides. Definitely a very like excellent faction to say the least. All right, so I'll quickly just like save and like make this a tier list. So one moment, and there we go. How I basically rate the Gallic roster in like Rome's Total War. I have to say, I was actually expecting to like make as many like tier lists for like Total War Roman Masters they basically have at this point. I obviously played a fruity game for like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Basically, consider like factors basically like 3 factions of 1 for these guys. Basically, like played half of the rosters basically for like Total War Roman Masters, so to speak. I'll be interested to basically keep doing so, but whatever. That's basically it for this one, so take care.